Beijing has quietly woven a dangerous web of control over major seaports across Latin America and the Caribbean.
Did you know 80% of U.S. port cranes are made by China? The United States is under siege, not with missiles or troops, but through a silent, calculated strategy that threatens its very backyard. China has strategically seized influence over 37 critical seaports across Latin America, the Caribbean, and even Canada, positioning itself as a master player in a global game of chess. Experts warning that even ports on U.S. soil are now dependent on Chinese-controlled equipment.
Should everyday Americans be concerned about this?
Absolutely. You wouldn't even have to go to war to destroy our economy. You could shut down these ports right here.
While the U.S. has been distracted by noisy conflicts in the Middle East and Asia, Beijing has created a system of economic and strategic control, very similar to America's own playbook of securing influence. You know how the U.S. sets bases all around the world? That is exactly what China's doing, but doing it in the most terrifying way. The reason is, China did it without making noise, and no one seemed to notice until it was too late. By the time the U.S. took notice, it was already encircled.
This covert network now threatens to give China the power to spy on U.S. military movements, strangle vital shipping lanes, and even launch a surprise strike on American soil.
The stakes couldn't be higher. This is hybrid warfare at its finest, and China is outmaneuvering the U.S. in its own hemisphere. So the question is, will America wake up before it's completely boxed in? Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe and hit the like button to support the channel. It really helps us out. Now let's get into it. China has gained influence over 37 major seaports across Latin America, the Caribbean, and even Canada, positioning itself as a master strategist. Now let me explain. China's approach to gaining influence over ports is rooted in its Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. The BRI is a massive global infrastructure project launched in 2013. Unlike the US, which often uses military presence or overt political pressure to secure influence, China offers economic lifelines to struggling nations. In Latin America and the Caribbean, where many countries face debt and infrastructure gaps, China's loans, investments, and trade deals are hard to resist. For example, in Peru, China's state-owned COSCO Shipping Corporation built and now operates the Chancay port, a $3.5 billion deep-water facility set to become a major trade hub. In Brazil, Chinese firms control 90% of the port of Paranaguá, a key agricultural export hub. These investments, totaling over $150 billion in the region by 2025, give China control over critical infrastructure without firing a shot. This strategy copies how the U.S. has long secured influence in regions like the Middle East and Asia. For instance, the U.S. uses military bases in Qatar and Japan to project power and secure trade routes, often tying economic aid to political alignment. China, however, avoids the political baggage of military alliances. It presents itself as a partner in development, offering no-strings-attached loans that often come with hidden costs, like long-term leases or operational control. A 2025 CSIS report notes that only 10 of the 37 Chinese-linked port projects in Latin America involve direct ownership, but many grant Beijing significant operational influence, allowing it to monitor trade flows and gather intelligence. This subtle control is more effective than the U.S.'s overt approach, as it avoids triggering immediate alarm while achieving similar strategic goals. China's economic leverage also rewires trade relationships. In 2024, trade between China and Latin America exceeded $500 billion, with Brazil alone supplying 70% of China's soy imports. Chinese state-owned firms like COFCO are building massive export terminals, such as one at Brazil's Port of Santos, to boost agricultural exports. This is similar to the U.S. efforts to secure oil supplies in the Middle East through petrodollar agreements and military presence. But the difference is that China is not focusing on military bases. Instead, China's focus is on economic dependency, which creates a web of influence that is harder to disrupt. Countries like Venezuela and Ecuador, burdened by debt, rely on Chinese loans, giving Beijing leverage to shape their policies, much like the U.S. influences allies through trade deals and military aid. The 37 ports under Chinese influence are not just commercial hubs. They are potential military assets. Many, like Chancay in Peru and Kingston in Jamaica, are designed with dual-use capabilities. Docks deep enough for naval vessels, surveillance systems to monitor U.S. military movements, and proximity to strategic choke points like the Panama Canal. A 2025 CSIS report highlights that these ports could enable China to disrupt U.S. supply chains, host People's Liberation Army Navy, plan vessels, or conduct intelligence-gathering operations. This mirrors U.S. tactics in the Middle East, where bases like Al Udeid in Qatar serve both logistical and strategic purposes, allowing rapid deployment and surveillance of adversaries. China's dual-use strategy is particularly concerning near the Panama Canal, a vital artery for global trade. Chinese firms, such as Hutchison Holdings, operate ports at Balboa and Cristóbal, the canal's Pacific and Atlantic entrances. These ports handle significant trade volumes, ranking among the top in Latin America for throughput. In a crisis, China could delay or reroute shipments, disrupting U.S. supply chains. Remember when Trump was making so much fuss about China's control of the Panama Canal? Well, the Trump administration's warnings about Chinese control of the canal prove its strategic importance. A Baker Institute report argues that U.S. threats to retake the canal could backfire, pushing Panama closer to China and damaging U.S. credibility in the region. China's approach draws from its own playbook in places like Djibouti and Cambodia, where civilian infrastructure projects pave the way for military bases. In Latin America, instead of branding these as military sites, Beijing equips them with hidden operational features that can support military use if needed. For example, Chancay's deep-water berths could accommodate planned warships, and its surveillance systems could track U.S. naval activity. It is interesting how this is so much like the United States lily pad bases, which are small, flexible outposts in Asia and the Middle East designed for rapid deployment. China's efficiency lies in achieving a similar positioning with a minimal military footprint. But this is not where it ends. China's influence extends beyond Latin America to Canada, a critical U.S. ally. Chinese firms have invested in Canadian ports like Vancouver and critical mineral sectors, such as lithium and cobalt, essential for defense technologies. In Canada, China focuses on economic integration, acquiring stakes in logistics and energy companies to embed itself in North American supply chains. A 2025 Atlantic Council report notes that this low-profile dominance over logistics and resources gives China a geo-economic stronghold, a form of influence that rivals military might. China's Arctic ambitions further complicate the picture. As polar ice melts, new shipping routes are opening, and Chinese investments in Canadian northern infrastructure position Beijing to challenge U.S. dominance in North American waters. This parallels U.S. naval exercises in the South China Sea, which signal control over maritime routes. China's subtle approach, focusing on economic penetration rather than overt control, makes it harder for the U.S. to counter without alienating Canada, a key economic partner. The efficiency of this strategy lies in its deniability, allowing China to build influence without provoking immediate confrontation. But China's ambitions aren't confined to the north. Across Latin America, it is expanding its military presence indirectly, deepening ties through defense cooperation and technology transfers. The People's Liberation Army, PLA, has engaged in joint exercises with militaries in Brazil and Venezuela, and it has supplied surveillance systems, drones, and cyber tools to several governments. A striking example is China's Espacio Lejano space station in Argentina. Though labeled as a civilian facility, it functions with limited oversight and operates like sovereign Chinese territory, potentially supporting Beijing's military communications. This tactic mirrors U.S. operations abroad, where drone bases and special forces are deployed under the radar to project power without massive troop commitments. China's hybrid warfare tactics of combining economic, cyber, and military tools are particularly concerning for the Pentagon. Ports under Chinese control could host cyber warfare units or missile systems, posing a direct threat to U.S. soil. For example, in the Bahamas, Huawei's dominance in telecommunications raises fears of cyber espionage targeting U.S. citizens, as noted in a 2025 RMC report. This parallels U.S. freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, which assert control while gathering intelligence. Meanwhile, the U.S. has been slow to respond to China's advances, distracted by conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East. While Washington spends billions on military operations abroad, China has filled the void in Latin America, offering infrastructure and trade deals that the U.S. has failed to match. A 2025 Heritage Foundation report warns that the U.S. risks losing its backyard to Beijing as countries turn to China for economic support. Interestingly, this is so much like how the U.S. exploited China's domestic focus in the 2000s to expand its Asian presence, building alliances like the Quad to encircle China. The Trump administration's response so far has been sanctions on Chinese firms and warnings about the Panama Canal. It reflects growing alarm but lacks a cohesive strategy. A 2025 Baker Institute report argues that threats to retake the canal could alienate Latin American partners, boosting China's influence. The U.S.'s reliance on tariffs and military posturing contrasts with China's economic diplomacy, which wins goodwill among developing nations. For example, at the 2025 China-CELAC Forum, Xi Jinping pledged $9.2 billion in credit to Latin American countries, reinforcing Beijing's role as a key partner. Public opinion in South America is shifting toward China, with polls showing declining U.S. influence. A 2025 Council on Foreign Relations report notes that Brazil, Chile, and Colombia see China as a vital economic partner, especially amid U.S. tariffs under Trump's Liberation Day policy. Now, you may think that is the end of the issues. Unfortunately for the U.S., it gets worse. Shockingly, U.S. ports, which are the backbone of American trade, are worryingly exposed to China's influence through the equipment they use. Most of the cranes and technology that keep ports running come from Chinese companies, raising serious concerns about national security. This situation is the result of long-term economic decisions that slowly handed strategic power to Beijing. No conflict, no confrontation, just commercial leverage. The core issue is that about 80% of the giant cranes at U.S. ports from Los Angeles to Savannah are made by Shanghai Zhenhua Heavy Industries, ZPMC, a Chinese company. These cranes aren't just machines. They're packed with software and sensors that collect data. There's a real fear that this technology could be used by China's government to spy on U.S. trade, track military shipments, or even shut down ports in a crisis. In 2023, a U.S. House committee flagged these risks, pointing out that some ZPMC cranes had strange communication devices that weren't listed in their specs. This suggests China could have ways to access or control the cranes remotely. How did the U.S. end up in this mess? It goes back to the 1990s and 2000s when American ports, like many businesses, turned to China for cheaper equipment. After China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, it became the go-to source for everything, including port cranes. ZPMC offered high-quality cranes at low prices, backed by government support, while U.S. manufacturers like Paceco couldn't keep up. Over time, America lost the ability to build these cranes itself, leaving ports stuck relying on China. The problem isn't just cranes. Ports also use Chinese-made cameras, automated systems, and software from companies like Hikvision. These could be hacked to disrupt supply chains or steal sensitive data. The Biden administration tried to tackle this in 2024 with new rules to improve port cybersecurity. But replacing Chinese equipment is easier said than done. A single crane costs $10 to $15 million, and swapping out dozens of them would bankrupt many port operators. Plus, there's no quick way to rebuild American factories to make these cranes from scratch. Trump is already targeting these cranes at the ports, but getting free from China's grip is possible, but it won't happen fast. The U.S. could invest in homegrown manufacturing, like it's doing with computer chips, but building cranes requires special skills, factories, and supply chains that take years to develop. If tensions with China worsen, ports could face shortages of parts or new equipment, making things even harder. For now, the U.S. has to tighten security, think stricter inspections and better cyber defenses, while dealing with the fact that its ports depend on a country it doesn't fully trust. This dependency isn't just a business problem. It's a national security risk that needs urgent attention, even if the fix will take time. Right now, the picture is grim. China has surrounded the U.S. with a chain of foreign ports and holds the keys to critical equipment inside American ports themselves. With controls stretching from Latin America to U.S. soil, the threat is no longer distant. It's already here. So the big question is, what will Washington do about it, if anything? Don't miss what happens next. Subscribe and stay informed as this global power struggle unfolds.